At 3 o'clock in the morning, a call pierced the silence of Ouagadougou, not from Paris, not from Washington, from the Kremlin itself. On the other end was Vladimir Putin, the man who had stared down NATO, bent global energy markets to his will, and outplayed rivals on the chessboard of Syria. Yet at this hour, his voice carried something unfamiliar, not command, not calculation, but concern. Why would the most seasoned strategist of our age reach across continents in the dead of night to a 35-year-old soldier turned revolutionary? Why would the Kremlin tremble at the footsteps of a landlocked nation, long dismissed as fragile and dependent? The answer lies in a new path that Burkina Faso and its allies have chosen, a path that refuses both Western tutelage and Eastern control, a path that redraws the map of power itself. Stay with us, for what follows is not a story. It is a reckoning. It is a reminder that when sovereignty is seized with bare hands and burning will, even the world's greatest powers must stop, listen, and learn. Subscribe and walk with us, because history is unfolding here, and you deserve to witness it. 6 months before that fateful call, something happened in West Africa that had not been seen in over 6 decades. For the first time since the colonial flags were lowered, 3 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, stood shoulder to shoulder and told the world's great powers to leave. Their decision was not whispered in backroom negotiations. It was thundered from the parade grounds, from the radio waves, from the soil that had absorbed too much blood and too many broken promises. Foreign military bases, long symbols of dependency and humiliation, were expelled in a coordinated act of defiance. This was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was not about swapping one master for another. The alliance they forged was different, an alliance born from shared pain and shared purpose. No NATO command structure, no Russian umbrella, no Chinese leverage, just African nations declaring that security would no longer be rented out to foreign powers, but grown from their own hands, watered by their own sacrifice. For Burkina Faso, the declaration was more than political theater. It was survival. For years, insurgencies had torn at the fabric of the nation, often worsened by the very foreign troops who claimed to protect it. Villages burned while foreign bases expanded. Farmers buried their sons while convoys of gold and cotton left for foreign shores. The imbalance was grotesque. Resources flowed out, weapons flowed in, and dignity evaporated in between. But in the dusty courtyards of Ouagadougou and Bamako, something shifted. Soldiers who once saluted outsiders now swore allegiance only to their soil. Mothers who once feared that their sons would die as proxies now whispered prayers that their deaths would mean independence, not dependency. It was in this climate of awakening that a more radical decision was made, one that struck at the very heart of global economics. Burkina Faso announced that it would no longer export raw gold to be refined abroad. For decades, the arithmetic was brutal and simple. Africa sold raw gold at $60 a gram, only to buy back refined gold at $200, $140 siphoned away with each gram. Wealth stolen, not with bayonets, but with balance sheets. The new policy declared enough. The country would refine its own gold, keep the surplus, and reinvest it in its own people. This was more than economics. It was metaphor. It was the seed refusing to be uprooted, choosing instead to sprout and bear fruit where it was planted. It was the farmer deciding not to sell soil, but to harvest dignity. And in that choice lay a quiet revolution, a declaration that Africa's wealth would no longer be the raw material of other nations' prosperity. The world noticed. Paris bristled. Washington frowned. Beijing calculated. But Moscow was unsettled in a way no one expected. For 2 decades, Russia's strategy in Africa had been clear. It waited for frustration, with Western arrogance, then stepped in with an offer. Russian arms for loyalty, Russian advisors for access, Russian protection in exchange for influence. The model was predictable, transactional, and effective. Until now, Burkina Faso and its allies had torn up the script. They did not replace French boots with Russian ones. They did not substitute American lectures with Chinese loans. They wrote their own chapter, one that neither East nor West could easily interpret. And then came the twist that sent shockwaves through intelligence briefings in Moscow. The partners chosen by Burkina Faso were not foreign ministries or multinational corporations. They were African American engineers, scientists, and doctors, men and women bound not by treaties, but by heritage, outsiders who were not outsiders, professionals who understood both the cutting edge of technology and the burning needs of African societies. That choice was unprecedented. It meant that for the first time in modern memory, Africa was not looking outward for saviors, but sideways, to brothers and sisters who had been scattered by the tides of history, but were now returning as collaborators. For Putin and his circle, this was disorienting. For years, they had believed Africa's sovereignty could only be mediated through great power sponsorship. Yet here was a small, landlocked nation demonstrating that true sovereignty could be crafted with African hands and diaspora minds, without Kremlin approval, without Washington's permission, without Beijing's bankroll. And so the reports piled on the Russian president's desk. They spoke of expelled foreign troops, new gold refineries, and unlikely partnerships that defied every assumption. Each report carried the same subtext. Africa was no longer waiting. Africa was no longer begging. Africa was no longer bargaining from weakness. But what truly alarmed Moscow was not the bases that were closed, nor the gold that was refined, nor even the alliances that were forged. It was something else, something that cut to the bone of Russia's influence in Africa. Because what truly unsettled the Kremlin was not the resources we kept, but the partners we chose. And that choice was about to redraw the map of global power. The Kremlin had seen African coups before. It had seen resource nationalism before. What it had never seen, what its analysts had failed to imagine, was a network of African Americans helping to design systems that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, Russian technology. When Dr. Marcus Johnson, a software engineer raised in Detroit, arrived in Ouagadougou with a team of African American coders, the Russians expected another symbolic gesture. But within months, Burkina Faso's military communication systems were running on a platform more secure than the Russian equivalents Moscow had spent years refining. Encryption algorithms inspired not by Soviet blueprints, but by the ingenuity of a diaspora, long forced to innovate in hostile environments. When Dr. Kesa Williams, a renewable energy expert trained at MIT, helped design solar grids in Mali and wind systems in Niger, the Russian strategists assumed the projects would collapse under African infrastructure constraints. Instead, they delivered results Russia itself had struggled to achieve in its vast, energy-rich territories: decentralized networks, low-cost maintenance, and independence from fossil fuel imports. Then came Dr. Michael Thompson, a cardiovascular surgeon from Atlanta, whose contribution shocked Moscow most of all. He was not building weapons, nor refineries, but training programs in medicine that drew students from across Africa. These were young Africans who might once have been lured to Moscow with scholarships and Soviet nostalgia. Now, they stayed on the continent, drawn by world-class facilities built not by Kremlin grants, but by diaspora expertise rooted in both science and heritage. For the Russian intelligence community, this was more than puzzling. It was humiliating. Their reports, marked urgent and stamped for Putin's desk, carried a sentence that would later define the crisis. If this African-American alliance succeeds, Russia will lose Africa without a single shot being fired. That was the context behind the 3 a.m. call. Putin, a man who rarely wasted time on symbolism, dialed Traore directly. No interpreter, no aid. He spoke in flawless French, a rarity in his diplomacy. At first, his tone was confident, rehearsed. He offered the same deal Russia had offered dozens of leaders before: protection against Western meddling, weapons in exchange for alignment, experience in exchange for loyalty. But Traore's reply shattered the script. With respect, Russia has been in Africa for 20 years, and you are still fighting France and America for influence. We have been truly independent for 18 months, and we are already achieving results your experts called impossible. Perhaps you should be asking what Russia can learn from Africa. Then came the silence, 37 seconds of silence, as the Kremlin's master strategist absorbed words he had never expected to hear from a leader of a landlocked African state. When Putin spoke again, the authority in his voice had drained away. What replaced it was something more rare, more dangerous: curiosity. President Traore, he asked slowly, what exactly are you building in Africa? It was in that moment that the call shifted from an offer of patronage to an inquiry born of vulnerability. Traore explained the model. Not anti-Western, not pro-Russian, but authentically African. A model built on shared heritage with African Americans who returned not to dominate, but to contribute. A model that fused advanced technology with local wisdom, modern medicine with traditional healing, and cutting-edge networks with communal values. Putin listened, and as he listened, his tone changed again. This time, the concern of a rival was replaced by the awe of a man confronting an unfamiliar paradigm. The man who had outmaneuvered NATO, who had rebuilt Russia from Soviet ashes, was now asking questions that revealed both respect and fear. Could this alliance of bloodlines succeed where empires had failed? Could cultural connection prove stronger than strategic coercion? The reports would later describe the call as lasting 47 minutes. But those who understand diplomacy know the length is less important than the transformation within it. By the end of that hour, Putin was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. He was grappling with a reality that threatened his entire Africa policy, and perhaps his worldview itself. For Moscow, the humiliation was doubled by the fact that this shift had not been forced by armies or sanctions, but by ideas, by the notion that sovereignty could be built not through dependency on new patrons, but through reconnection with scattered kin. That was the real climax of the story. A continent once treated as a pawn, forcing even the grandmasters of geopolitics to reconsider the board. And yet, the most revealing part of that night was not what Putin offered, but what he admitted. And those admissions would ripple through Africa and beyond. When dawn broke after that midnight conversation, Burkina Faso was not the same. Neither was the Kremlin. What had begun as a phone call became a mirror, a reflection of Africa not as the weak link of global politics, but as the frontier of a new order. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the news spread like wildfire. People spoke of the president who had stood toe-to-toe with Putin and turned the tables. Mothers in the markets told their children that dignity had returned. Soldiers in the barracks whispered that for the first time, their sacrifices were not feeding foreign bases, but securing African soil. The immediate consequence was confidence. For decades, politics in Burkina Faso had been framed in the language of dependence. Who would provide aid? Who would guarantee protection? Who would buy resources? Now the language changed. It became about what Burkinabe could do for themselves, and how much further they could go if they refused both East and West. The economic impact was felt most sharply in gold. By keeping the refining process inside its borders, the nation retained a margin once lost to foreign refineries. That difference was not theoretical. It meant more schools funded from domestic revenue. It meant clinics supplied without waiting for international loans. It meant that for once, the nation's veins of gold nourished its own people, not the coffers of Paris, Dubai, or Moscow. In politics, the ripple was deeper still. Traoré's defiance gave courage to others. Mali and Niger strengthened their alliance with Burkina Faso, shifting from isolated regimes to a bloc with coherence and momentum. They called it the Alliance of Sahel States. To outsiders, it was a military pact. To insiders, it was a covenant, proof that unity born of shared wounds could mature into unity of purpose. Yet sovereignty always has a cost. Western governments responded with warnings, subtle threats, and the withdrawal of certain forms of aid. Some sanctions were whispered, others enforced. But these measures, rather than breaking resolve, hardened it. Citizens began to ask a dangerous question. If our leaders can stand without French troops or Russian bases, why should we accept the conditionality of Western loans? Why should we bend to dictates that come attached to aid packages? This is what made the Kremlin's alarm justified. The danger to traditional powers was not the loss of a single gold contract or a single base. It was the emergence of a mindset. Africa no longer begging, but bargaining, and bargaining from strength. And here lies the heart of what one might call anti-colonial Africa, not just the rejection of former colonizers, but the rejection of the colonial logic itself, the assumption that African survival required foreign guardianship. That assumption had underpinned the policies of Paris, Washington, and yes, Moscow. Now it was crumbling. The social consequences were just as profound. In universities, young students debated what it meant to be sovereign in a digital age. Was sovereignty just about borders and armies? Or also about owning data, protecting innovation, building universities that shaped rather than exported minds? In villages, elders told old proverbs with new meaning. The tree grows tall, not when it leans on another, but when its roots hold fast in its own ground. The effect on national identity was electric. For decades, being Burkinabe was to be defined by what the country lacked: resources, coastline, influence. Now, it was defined by what the country dared: the courage to expel foreign bases, the audacity to keep its gold, the imagination to partner with kin across oceans. But no transformation is without tension. Critics warned of overreach. Could a landlocked country really sustain industries that giants struggled to manage? Could alliances of three small states stand against the combined pressure of NATO, Russia, and China? These were valid questions, and they remain unanswered. Yet even in doubt lay a new form of pride: the right to attempt, the right to fail on one's own terms rather than succeed as a client. What the Kremlin most feared was not failure, but success. If Burkina Faso proved that independence could be more than a slogan, then the spell would break across the continent. No longer would leaders be able to justify dependency as the price of survival. No longer would the logic of protectorates, spheres of influence, and special relationships go unchallenged. In that sense, the phone call was more than dialogue. It was rupture, a tear in the veil of assumptions that had cloaked Africa for centuries. And from that tear emerged a new image, fragile, untested, but radiant. An Africa that could say no without collapsing. An Africa that could say yes to itself. And so, the question spread beyond Burkina Faso. If this small nation can stand, what stops others? And if Africa can redefine itself, what does that mean for every region still shackled by dependency? In Moscow, the aftermath of that call was immediate. Within 3 days, Putin convened his Africa advisors in an emergency session. For years, Russia had built its African presence on predictable pillars: security contracts, mercenary deployments, resource concessions. Now, the president himself declared that this model was obsolete. The Kremlin's own reports admitted it. If we continue treating Africa as a region that needs our guidance rather than a continent that can guide itself, we will become irrelevant. What followed was a shift that surprised even seasoned observers. Russia began to speak less of military bases and more of technology transfers. Education programs, not just arms deals, were announced. The rhetoric shifted from patronage to partnership. It was, for many, a tacit admission that Moscow had been forced to learn humility. But Russia was not alone in its recalculations. In Beijing, analysts examined why their billion-dollar investments had not achieved the influence that African-American partnerships had created with far smaller sums. They concluded that what money could not buy, cultural bonds could. The lesson was unnerving. Even the deepest pockets could not compete with the legitimacy of shared heritage. In Brussels, European leaders wrestled with a different anxiety. Their historical ties to Africa, once thought unbreakable, were losing meaning. The colonial languages, the aid programs, the development summits were no longer binding Africa to Europe. A different kind of connection was rising, one that drew strength not from colonial residue, but from diasporic reunion. And in Washington, the reaction was mixed. On one hand, some policymakers saw opportunity. African-American professionals returning to the continent could be framed as a bridge, an asset to American influence. But others feared precisely the opposite, that by aligning with Africa on equal terms, these professionals were undermining the very architecture of U.S. dominance. For the first time, the State Department found itself studying the decisions not of presidents or parliaments, but of diaspora engineers and surgeons. At the African Union, the implications were profound. Could this model of partnership rooted in bloodlines rather than treaties be scaled continent-wide? Could African sovereignty be strengthened not through foreign alliances, but through the return of scattered communities? The question lingered in Addis Ababa and in capitals across the continent. What became clear was this: the conversation at 3 a.m. was not just a moment between two men. It was a signal to the world that the center of gravity was shifting. That African sovereignty was no longer a phrase spoken in conferences, but a reality tested on the ground. And so, as Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and Washington recalibrated, a larger question emerged. If Africa can reimagine power, what stops other peoples, scattered, silenced, underestimated, from doing the same? What unsettled the Kremlin most was not the defiance of the past, but the promise of the future. For when Putin asked, "What will you do next?" the answer revealed a horizon far larger than one nation. Burkina Faso, did not imagine itself in isolation. The vision was of 30 African countries joining this model within 2 years, a continental movement where sovereignty was not theory but practice. Universities would rise that did not mimic Oxford or Sorbonne, but blended cutting-edge science with ancestral wisdom. Students from Dakar to Dar es Salaam would learn not only engineering and medicine, but also the history of resistance, the discipline of self-reliance, and the art of building without asking permission. In economics, the plan was not to imitate Silicon Valley or Shenzhen. It was to create uniquely African solutions, telecommunications more affordable than Europe's, renewable energy grids more resilient than Russia's, health systems more inclusive than America's. By anchoring progress in the soil of the continent, Africa could compete globally not as a copy, but as an original. Politically, the path ahead was fraught. Sanctions might intensify. Foreign pressure would mount. Propaganda would multiply. Yet the leaders of the Sahel Alliance argued that sovereignty was never the absence of struggle. It was the presence of choice. For the first time in living memory, Africans could choose a future not written in Paris, Moscow, or Washington, but carved by their own calloused hands. The diaspora was central to this journey. For African Americans and other scattered communities, returning was not nostalgia. It was renewal. It was the chance to turn exile into expertise, memory into momentum, fracture into family. Their role was not to lead, but to reconnect. Not to command, but to collaborate. And in that collaboration lay the seed of a renaissance powerful enough to terrify world powers. What lay ahead then was not only development, but demonstration. A demonstration that when a people reclaims its unity, no empire can dictate its destiny. A demonstration that sovereignty is not a gift granted by treaties, but a harvest earned by courage. And so, the story does not end with a midnight call. It begins there. For the truest test of this new Africa is not what has been won, but what remains to be built. And that question, what will we build next, is the one that still echoes in the corridors of power from Ouagadougou to Moscow. A phone call at 3 a.m. might seem like a detail of protocol, a curiosity of diplomacy, but in truth, it was a signal. The moment when a continent long underestimated revealed its hand, and the world's grandmasters paused in recognition. What unfolded between Ibrahim Traoré and Vladimir Putin was not simply dialogue, but disruption. For generations, Africa was told it could not stand without support, told that development meant dependency, that progress meant patronage, that sovereignty was a mask for weakness. But in a single conversation, those assumptions cracked. Putin himself admitted it. Africa might not need to depend on anyone if Africans work together effectively. That admission matters more than any aid package or summit declaration. It is the confession of a superpower that the balance of history can tilt. This is the spirit of anti-colonial Africa. Not only the rejection of domination, but the crafting of a new reality where Africans claim the right to succeed or fail on their own terms. It is not about hatred of the past, but the dignity of the future. It is the courage to say, we will refine our gold, defend our soil, and teach our children without waiting for foreign approval. It is also the dawn of African sovereignty, a sovereignty not fragile or symbolic, but lived. A sovereignty where diaspora partnerships bring home knowledge, where cultural bonds replace colonial chains, where leadership means lifting, not leaning. This sovereignty is not loud, but steady, not imposed, but chosen. And that choice, once made, is irreversible. What the Kremlin, Beijing, Brussels, and Washington now confront is not the threat of another rival, but the emergence of a model they cannot control. A model that proves power does not always come from dominating others, but from empowering one's own people. If Africa can achieve this, what stops others? If Burkina Faso can stand, why not the Caribbean, the Pacific, or the indigenous nations of the Americas? The world is watching, but more importantly, Africa is building. The question is no longer whether change is possible. The question is how fast this vision will spread, how deeply it will take root, and how courageously it will be defended. So, walk with us, share this story, subscribe to this journey, for history is no longer written only in the capitals of empire. It is being written in the fields of Africa, in the hands of its people, and in the voices of a diaspora returning home. And this time, the harvest will be ours.